she is best known, at least most recently, for having been one of the co-inventors of the alternate reality game genre, also known as transmedia. And she's going to tell us some of her thoughts about the field as it is now and as it is changing. So, welcome, Susan.
So can everyone hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Great. So as Celia mentioned, I'm walking over here to this building thinking that it was 30 years ago when I graduated. I don't look that old, right?
No.
This is the interactive part of me. So I started as an engineer here. I went to Gatech from 79 to 84 on the cooperative education program. And my first job, when I went to go and see what they had for people who were engineers that were going to work their way through school, I had the opportunity to work on Epcot. So I got to work on Epcot from a year before groundbreaking to a year after opening, which was quite an amazing experience. To both be exposed to just this incredibly ambitious project, but also to be exposed to an organization, which at the time was called WED, and then later they changed their name to Imaginary, that were all focused on both the guest experience and also everyone was bought into a bigger idea than whatever their individual work was. So after Epcot, I went to work for Lockheed Martin for about 7 years. And then when Michael Eisner and Frank Wells took over Disney, I came back for what is quote unquote called the Disney Decade, which was 1990 to 2000. And that was where there was a tremendous surge in theme park development and in pushing the envelope for theme park rides and trying to get the space between the audience and the ride to kind of vanish and go away. In 2000, at the end of the Disney Decade, everyone was like, what's going to happen next? What's with the internet? What is it? So a lot of really, really talented Imagineers went into all kinds of different businesses for the web. A lot of people thought we were just going to put interactive television on the web, but that, of course, did not happen. I actually went into game development, so I went to work at a company called Cyan Worlds, the company who developed Mist and Ribbon, to work on a massively multiplayer online game called Parable, but then it got published under Uru Ages Beyond Mist. And from there, I met up with a lot of the guys who were working on Xbox Live, Xbox content, kind of thinking about what's next. And that's when I started 42 Entertainment with some good friends of mine. And we are now in our 10th year at 42 Entertainment. So lots of interesting things. So when you're thinking about what's my career path from Georgia Tech, you don't have to do one thing. You will see, though, that there is kind of a stick-to-itness that when you get into these industries where you want to get to the point where you know enough about it where you can really contribute to them. That was just my public service announcement to not change jobs every year. So what a lot of people are really kind of torn up about the term transmedia, and I'm sure that you've heard it called different things and heard people give you different definitions about it. Transmedia does actually mean multiple things, but I'll tell you, for our company, transmedia has always meant creating an immersive experience where the center of it is you, the guest, the audience, and that you have a role in it, you're allowed to participate in it, and that the world is around you, and there are multiple ways for you to pop in and out of it. The way these types of experiences can be delivered sometimes can be very unusual. Sometimes they're buzzworthy, sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's just technology that just makes it accessible to everyone. But what really holds it together is story. So one of the interesting things about making some of the first alternate reality games that was kind of a big eye-opening revelation coming from massively online role-playing games is that whereas in MMO, you get to dictate what you do, when you group up, where you go, how all that works. In alternate reality games, people came together and they were able to have these very personal moments, but yet the community was huge and they could collaborate together. So there's a lot of different words for that. People have called it the hive mind, collective intelligence. intelligence. But what is really cool and exciting about it is you get a whole bunch of people to come together and be focused and hone in on their power, and their power of community and being connected by the web. So that's really, really cool. A lot of the early alternate reality games we wove in and around other kind of more traditional entertainment products like a console game or a television series or a film series. However, there have been a lot of original alternate reality games, so I'm going to show you something that's kind of in the middle today. Just to kind of give you a little bit about my background, one of the first things that I did during the Disney decade was the Indiana Jones ride. If anybody's ever been to Disneyland, the goal was to get you to walk in the footsteps of Indiana Jones. And the reason why I wanted to show you this is because I know Celia talks a lot about game theory, and there's a tremendous amount of game theory in alternate reality games. But there's also a tremendous amount of what I call the art of reassurance, which is something I learned from Disney, which is as people move from platform to platform, can you keep them in an environment where they're open and receptive to story and experience? So this was one of my first attractions, and again, one of the things I learned from Disney is focus on the guest, and the art of reassurance is really about taking away things that are distracting and the cares and concerns of the world. So here we had the opportunity to do the first moving simulator through three-dimensional sets. There was a lot of choreography between what happens on the ride vehicle, what's happening off the ride vehicle, characters that you would interact with, and then there was the whole lead up to this kind of 4-minute thrill ride experience. And essentially, because this was a property that was started by Lucas and was owned by Lucasfilm, this was my first exposure to the whole idea of a world Bible. And someone who kept all the details, like how we had to go in and figure out all of the details of where we were, what we were doing, how would Indiana Jones have been there between the second and the third movie. All these things that, again, to people who are just going there and experiencing it, they may not be able to pinpoint all this level of detail, but it's really important. It all adds up. So one of the last things I did as an Imagineer was do Mission Space, which back at Epcot, have any of you ever been on this ride? Yay! So this was, the idea here was to do a ride that was the first ride to simulate vertical motion and the sensation of going into space. So we actually designed it on a real 20-foot centrifuge arm. And as you might imagine, worked with NASA to try to get a lot of the details about what astronauts went through to go into the ride and then make it fun. So going into space, as you might imagine, and training for space can sometimes be very physically kind of exertive. So we had to kind of find that line of what's it like to sit in a capsule, to have 3 people that you depend on. You're looking out the window, that's really your only window into what's happening outside the world. And this is where I really started kind of really wanting to have variability and to have people work together and actually have agency, actually cause something to happen that wasn't pre-programmed to happen. And so that's kind of where I left and went into gaming and created Mist Online, or Uru Ages Beyond Mist. You play yourself. How many people have played that? So
This is for the book I wrote about it, and this is for playing it.
some people know more about it than I do, and I was there for the design. But essentially, there were a lot of really great ideas. This was around 2000. We were looking at what business models really worked on the web, and the one that really worked was the subscription model for MMOs. So, but the idea here was, well, could you take a step back and could you really play yourself? Could you take some of the, just the grind and the achievement and the killing out of it, and could you do something that's more exploratory, more story-driven, more character-driven? So there were a lot of really ambitious and interesting goals that were kind of put into this MMO. So there was a lot of really interesting kind of lessons kind of bubbling around, but the biggest one that people were kind of talking about is, can't we, now that this was at the dawn of, broadband penetration and mobile devices, can't we just use the world as the game board? Can't we just essentially bring people together to play a game in the world? And that was kind of the premise by which we started 42. So here you can see, it's not just me, it's lots and lots and lots of people, both past, present, and future. But that one of the things that we kind of focused on is, now that we have this digitally connected tissue, what are the new forms of experiences and storytelling that we can kind of bring out? So you probably have heard of some of these projects. I Love Bees was one of the first ARGs that happened, and right now playing we have Infamous Paper Trails. Anybody playing that? So, yay! PS4 player in the house. But essentially, one of the things, so how did this kind of art form, kind of game form kind of evolve? And I Love Bees actually won Innovative Game at GDC the year it came out, because people were like, well, what is it? Is it a game? What is it? Is it interactive fiction? What is it? Nobody knew. And people today are still debating some of these questions. But what happened is that game developers had created a massive history of the world of Halo. How many people play Halo? I can guarantee you these people have dug down into what the fiction and the backstory of Halo is, to the point where it's going to take years for all of this fiction to kind of manifest itself. So they started writing books, and they wanted to make movies, and they wanted to do a whole lot of things. So the idea behind I Love Bees was really, you can't tell that much story in a first-person shooter, so how can we tell a prequel game where really the focus is on story and the focus is on experience? And we've been able to do that quite a bit of time. So here you can see we're working on a PlayStation 4 game. This is the first exclusive PlayStation 4 title, Infamous Second Son. If you haven't gotten it, immediately go to GameStop and get this game. It's really an awesome game, and we co-developed with Sucker Punch the idea of marrying episodic content with a console game. So whereas I Love Bees was a prequel to Halo, now we're saying, well, when you get the disc, how can we keep you in the world? How can we give you different experiences that are different from just plowing through 40 or 50 hours of gameplay. So again, if you don't know the story of Infamous Second Son, there are conduits in the world, and we don't know if they're good or bad. And you might be one. So you need to go get tested and see if you're a conduit. So go to enjoyyourpower.com, and you can see what that experience is like. But essentially, it's, again, we believe anything is possible. So I think I want to, well, I'll talk about this for just a second before. I think the best way to kind of demonstrate this would be to show you a project. But before I do, working on console games, working on MMOs, transmedia is really a different type of level design, because you're not trying to get people in and then move them up this triangle or move them down the triangle. What you're trying to do is at every moment, you're trying to give multiple levels of audience a different experience that's cohesive. So an example of this might be, we did an alternate reality game leading up to the Dark Knight. And if you didn't really know what an alternate reality game was, you might get the one sentence explanation of, you get to live in Gotham City. It's like, okay, I get that. What does that mean? Well, does that mean that I can read the paper? Oh, yeah, you can. And so you can go down and drill down as far as you want. But for people who are just living in Gotham City every day, they just been getting those top level headlines, just like you do in Atlanta. So it's a different type of level design, and there's really a lot of science behind it. But what I wanted to kind of share with you guys, and I'll go through these quickly, and then I want to show you an example, is there's a lot of things that we've done and experimented with that are lessons learned that if we were making the same thing that we were making 10 years ago, we wouldn't be around. So just like any other art form, the beginning of television, the beginning of console games, and console games are about to evolve again, MMOs, everything evolves. And so this format is evolving as well. So going back to what I was talking about, transmedia, some people view transmedia as a single experience where you're going across platforms, you're trying to take people through a story. Maybe it's a story that they contribute to, maybe it's something that they're discovering over time, but it's kind of this encapsulated experience that's over multiple platforms and played out over time. Other people think of transmedia as, well, I have a story world, and I'm I'm going to imagine bits and pieces of that story world on the native platforms that they want to be on. So I could argue The Walking Dead is a great transmedia example, because when I'm playing The Walking Dead, I can be making myself look like The Walking Dead. Or if I'm in Atlanta, I can go be an extra. How many people have done that? You guys haven't gotten on The Walking Dead yet? I would be like out there all the time. You know, Gooby, do something, I want. But anyway, every time it's on, I say, my hometown. Like it, you know, like the apocalypse is something to really be proud of. But you know, you look at things like, you know, any big, huge franchise that you can think of Batman. You know, there's 7 decades of comic books. There's not just one, but multiple franchises that kind of spun out of that. There's TV shows, there's animated shows, there's physical product. So I think transmedia is a word that people haven't kind of gotten their arms around, but what it means is that now, because we have so many platforms, there's so many more opportunities to tell stories. So going back to kind of a transmedia experience, which is something that plays out across platforms, one of the most important design things that you need to know before you get started is you have to know where you're going in order to arrive there. So here's an example of that. We started out to tell a transmedia experience between the last frame of Batman Begins and the first frame of The Dark Knight. And one of the first things, and this goes back to being very similar to traditional game design, is coming out and designing what's the whole spine of the experience. And in this case, we had 3 major characters, 3 major character arcs. There was also the mob in there. There were also the citizens of Gotham City. And we knew that this had to play out over time, and we knew what ultimately was going to happen in the movie. So we wanted to create experiences where the audience that participated in this actually got payoff, where they actually made something happen in the movie and could say, we did that, we made that happen. So an interesting example of that would be the prologue. Do you guys remember the 7-minute prologue where the Joker robbed the bank?
Yep.
So right before that, we had about 6 or 7 weeks of interactive fiction where the players had to, you know, break into the Gotham City Unified School District, and they had to, you know, obtain the you know, contents of one of the employees' lockers there, and in there was a District 29 or District 20 school bus driver's badge, and so as there were many levels of fiction, but that was one of the things that they had to retrieve. And then when they were watching the prologue, the Joker escaped in a District 20 school bus. So they were like, oh, well, we did that. We actually gave him access to that. So there were a lot of really interesting ways to kind of play around with. There were actually 34 weeks of interactive fiction over 15 months in the Why So Serious. However, one thing that we've learned is that interactive fiction exhaustion sets in after about 6 or 8 weeks, depending on what it is and what you're telling. It could be 6 weeks, it could be on the short side, or it could be, sometimes it could be 10 weeks. But really, people, no matter how good the story is, after about 8 weeks, they're just kind of, there's just an exhaustion that sets in, and so you start to lose your audience. The other thing is that how many people have been part of debunking a hoax on the internet? A really good recent example of this was, so the Blair Witch Project. Do you think that would work today? I don't think that would work today because we're so jaded. You know, we would be immediately set about trying to figure out if that really happened. So a good example of this was the Joaquin Phoenix movie, where he supposedly retired. Did you guys see that? He supposedly retired, and you know, Casey Affleck was following him around and making a movie, and it turns out it wasn't real. And so, you know, so don't perpetrate a hoax, because people will find you out. So you have to give audiences kind of a meaningful role, something meaningful to do. And the other thing is, you really want to respect them. So let me just jump to an example here real quickly. So how many people are familiar with Year Zero? So transmedia experts here. So a lot of times when, you know, when you're talking about the Dark Knight and you're saying to people, and especially, you know, guys that go to Georgia Tech guys and girls that go to Georgia Tech who may be classified as nerds or geeks or whatever. Not that those are bad words, those are all good words. But people will say, well, you know, yes, there's generations of people who grew up with Batman, so of course if you had the chance to live in Gotham City, you'd follow the rabbit pretty far down the rabbit hole. But what about something that nobody knows anything about? And so I think this is interesting. Year Zero is an interesting case study in the sense of no one expected Nine Inch Nails to tell an immersive, story-driven, you know, fiction story that actually tried to motivate people to take real, genuine action out in the real world. So I think it was very unusual, and it was very, from that sense, it was very unexpected. But also, this kind of shows the power of transmedia as something that could be used for good. And there's been a lot of people who've said, well, if we can bring people together as kind of a collective audience or collective intelligence, then why don't we do things for good? And as you guys know, it's hard to tell people what to care about, but entertainment can sometimes lead people to either have empathy for or lead them to an experience where they can walk in somebody else's shoes and see the world through somebody else's eyes. And I think that's what this experience did. So just to kind of give you the backstory of this. So Nine Inch Nails is essentially one person, if you didn't know, it's Trent Reznor. He was on tour and he started writing a new album. And he was kind of, in a sense, he was daydreaming about the future. So he started writing songs from different people's points of view. And started to think about, well, what does a concept album really mean today? When you don't get the physical album and you don't have liner notes, and it's, and thinking about people in the past who tried to do concept albums, what does that really mean? So he came to us, well, actually he wrote into info@42entertainment.com and said, hey, I played I Love Bees, and do you think that you could do something around this type of storytelling around music? And essentially he was concerned about things that were going on in the world, and he wanted to inspire people to think about a what-if scenario. What if we didn't do anything or change our course? What would really happen? And the other thing that he kind of shared with us right from the beginning is that bringing music to market, and as you guys know, the music industry has really gone through some challenges from a business model point of view. So it seemed like it was really broken. So the first thing that we did was try to come up with a fictional construct that could touch everyone. Again, it's like, what is that tagline? What's that one sentence where everybody could get it? So for us, it was, well, if I could tell you right now in Starbucks over at the bookstore, underneath one of the chairs, there's a note from the future. Would we all go? I think we would, because we want to know, right? Even if it's bad news, we still want to know what it is. So just kind of playing into that kind of thing that everyone really cares about. What if we could send a snapshot of the internet from the future back to today, and then have people kind of piece it together? And so that was the premise, which coincidentally is a premise that really fits the whole notion of transmedia, because it's on every type of media, every type of platform. So it felt really authentic. So once we had kind of the overarching premise for what the audience was going to do, they were essentially digital archaeologists who were trying to figure out, well, what happened in the future. Then we wanted to, because these people were really not people looking for either a game or interactive fiction, we wanted to do something very dramatic to kind of get their attention. So the band was on tour, so the first thing we did was take a tour t-shirt, and I don't know if you can see up there, but some of the letters are brighter than others. So if you look across, you can read this message, I'm trying to believe. So it took a couple of days, but one of the greatest things about this type of art form is that it only takes a few people to find it, and then they share it with everybody on the internet. So it took just a couple of days, people were finding this message, and of course they immediately went to this website, I Am Trying to Believe, and they saw something that looked really different to them. So it looked distorted because this is what information looks like when it comes from the future. We all saw Terminator, so you know something happens to it. It looked distorted, and this was the first time people had seen this kind of big hand kind of reaching down from the sky. And then there's this weird message about something that the government's putting in water, and it's affecting our brains or our minds. So now these are 9 Inch Nails fans, So they're like, what is going on? This seems really odd. Is the T-shirt manufacturer kind of having, some kind of weird thing? What's really behind this? And they quickly discovered from that one site, kind of a handful of sites that were all distorted and bringing out some really, really interesting ideas about, I don't know if you can see here, America's Born Again, but if you scroll over it, you would see that there's another version of the truth. And on there, there's some serious issues about what would you do in these situations, what really is discrimination, what the loss of personal liberties. So these are all like pretty serious issues. So within a few days, people had found this, but they had no idea what to make of it. So we wanted to immediately, again, because we're not trying to perpetrate a hoax, within those first few days, we wanted to connect it with the music, and say, hey, yes, this was found on a 9 Inch Nails t-shirt, and guess what? It is something that 9 Inch Nails is behind. So this goes back to the premise that everything in the pipeline for bringing the music to market was broken, because normally what happens is somebody somewhere along the production pipeline records a song and releases it. It's a bad cell phone version of a song the artist didn't want to get out first anyway. So Trent said, that's it, we're leaking all the music. So he came to us and said, how can we do this in the most, obscure way possible? And we had just read a study that they put out 10,000 thumb drives in Central Park in New York, and like 90% of them were picked up. So who knew? I guess that's innate curiosity or whatever. But so we said, well, let's put a song on Mark thumb drive and just leave a handful of them around the concert, venue and see what happens. And there was a lot of discussion about it. This wasn't just like a random thing. It was, we're not going to go to where everyone rushes, and goes early to rush the rail. We're not going to do it there. We're going to do it in places where people would just really stumble across it. So of course the person who found it in a urinal in the men's bathroom in Lisbon. This unmarked thumb drive. He picked it up, he takes it home, he puts it in his computer, and then he goes on the boards to say, I think I found a new 9 Inch Nails song. And of course he's instantly flamed because, as you know, the internet community is so open to new information and people bringing new information. So he's instantly flamed, and he said, well, let me upload it. Everybody listens to it, and they come to this, again, collective intelligence conclusion that, yes, that's Trent Reznor singing the song. What could this possibly mean? And so there was some static in the song itself, and people are again talking. Someone knows someone who's an audio engineer, so they run a spectrograph analyzer on it, and they see immediately this hand, which they saw on I'm Trying to Believe. So now they're starting to speculate. What does this all mean? And also, going back to the art of reassurance, they start to feel more comfortable. Because now they know this is endorsed by 9 Inch Nails. This is their music, this is their thing. Now I'm really interested in it, and I can share it with confidence because I know that it's a real 9 Inch Nails thing. So there was a lot of things that were kind of hidden in the music, but that kind of brought it all together, and that happened within the first 3 or 4 days. And from there, it was really a 10-week experience where they're constantly uncovering pieces of the future. They're working together to kind of solve pretty hard, and sophisticated puzzles that require them to work together. And we also introduced the idea that in the future, a lot of, liberties, things that we take for granted were different. And the way that people kind of were rising up against that was through art. Of course, we're working for an artist, so that makes sense, right? So we introduced the idea of art as resistance in the future. And this is the art as resistance site. And immediately when you went there, you were kind of met with this, if you had your audio speakers on, this very loud kind of clanging noise that says, stop by viewing this site. You're in direct violation of the federal, Orderly Conduct Act, and what does that really mean? So you could read down, what does that really mean? And for Nine Inch Nails fans, and by the way, this is the same for the Indiana Jones queue. When you're walking down the queue, it says, "Don't touch this." So how many people do you think touch it? Everybody, right? So stop, don't look at this. Everyone's all of a sudden looking at it and sharing it. And that kind of started an artist resistance movement. You have a voice, use it. And what was interesting about that, as kind of the band was traveling all over Europe, and we were kind of doing everything from street art to all kinds of interesting things that kind of brought up all these interesting, very close to reality things that were happening. This was a mural in London that was painted red where the Brixton riots were held, and it kind of, if you went to that URL, it told you very carefully how to take your microchip out in the future. Carefully, obviously. But it was close to things that could possibly happen. These are things that were being discussed. And so really it became this kind of combination of how could you get out this interactive fiction in really authentic ways that were being shared and spread by people and participating in by people, and then how could you also use everything in the chain of bringing music to market to kind of spread this idea. So by about the third week, there were like 3 million people who were kind of following all this stuff, which for Nine Inch Nails was like huge, right? And there was also a business model behind this because they wanted to convert people to their site and start direct marketing music to it, which is what ultimately happened. Everything from the music videos that were put out had codes and clues in the time code. The album itself, the physical medium of the album, was heat-sensitive ink. So when you put it in, it was black. When it came out, it was white, and it had binary code on it. Even the FBI warning on the packaging itself was a warning from the U.S. Bureau of Morality, and you could call right there and report if someone was looking at this material. So it's fueled by the people who participate in it. And the way that we kind of rewarded them was to take what were these concepts that they were uncovering, these realities of a world in the not too distant future, and transfer that to today. So like, how can we take action today to make sure this future doesn't really happen? Because again, if you watch Terminator, you can change the future. So they started working together. They created a lot of community art. They wrote a 125-page graphic novel. These guys really got into it. They really embraced this whole theme. And ultimately, we wrote them into the final exhibit from the future, where everyone who had an ID online was either, on the run, in prison, dead. And they all got their own individual Halo number, which if you're a Nine Inch Nails fan, you know how important that is. And many of them, of course, immediately had them tattooed. But they actually became part of the fiction of Year Zero. So to go back to where we were at. Sorry. One thing I get asked a lot is, well, who does this, right? Who's going to follow all? And the reality is, as you've probably seen some of the numbers up there, for the Dark Knight, like 11 million people were working together to kind of figure out what was happening in Gotham City before the Dark Knight came out, and work for the Joker or support Batman or campaign for Harvey Dent. And the reality is that a lot of people will do that if you respect them, if you give them a role, if it's added value. You don't want to just have them interact for the sake of interaction, but if you're giving them an added value experience in the world where they really are a part of it, then you're fulfilling a dream that they have. People want to dwell in these worlds. These worlds are so valuable to us. That's why we played Lord of the Rings online, and we're so mad that we couldn't go to Mordor and, save, be part of the fellowship, right? So you want to give people what they expect by dwelling in these worlds, but you also want to respect them. Some other things that we've learned, kind of the hard way is you don't want to just prove to people that you are smarter than them. This is not good entertainment. There's a difference between respecting players and thinking they're intelligent and trying to trip them up. So you definitely don't want to do things to make your audience look stupid. You want to make them look smart. Another thing is, with transmedia, you have the opportunity to cross people's paths. So we all live in an electric bubble. Or I should say, I live in an electric bubble. You probably don't. But, I always have, this and my mini iPad and my computer. And sometimes I have another computer as well. And the reality is that I'm always kind of connected. Whether it's to my family or my friends or the kids or whatever it is, I'm connected. And so there's many opportunities now to put entertainment in the path of people and to give them experiences that they can pop in and out of. I think one of the greatest things that we're seeing now in television programming is that people are actually responding to consumer behavior models and saying, just because it's not how we haven't always done it doesn't mean that it's bad. And there'll be a lot of experimentation with that and so transmedia gives the opportunity for you to cross the audience's paths and in multiple ways and on multiple levels. Allowing discovery. Some people might say that the whole rabbit hole theory, well, okay, that was novel in 2004, but maybe it's not novel today. But the reality is that if people discover something, they feel an innate sense of ownership of it, and it really does become their thing somehow. So I would allow discovery, and then make it accessible. Again, learning from what we've done, we've made some things that were incredibly inaccessible, except for the people who are really all in. And what you really want to do, going back to that triangle, is you want to make things that if I'm going to go spend 15 hours or whatever it is and not stop until I figure out exactly what is motivating the Joker, which you can never figure out because Agent of Chaos. But I'm all in to figure that out. I also want to be reaching at the same time the woman who doesn't even know about Batman, but she's interested in why Harvey Dent is running for district attorney. So you have to kind of make it accessible and don't just design for one level of audience. And then the last thing I'll tell you is that repetition it's not always bad. It's just almost always bad. But if people know what's coming up, then, again, look at episodic television. It could be awesome, but the fact that it's on every week, Tuesday night at 8 o'clock, there's a certain feeling that you get, like you can get geared up for that first one, but then it becomes harder and harder every week to come to it. I'm just saying that it's the same with transmedia. If you can bring mystery and surprise into it, where people don't really know what's going to happen next. The Dark Knight right now is in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most successful alternate reality game, and literally no one knew what was going to happen next, ever. Sometimes even us. It was literally something that was playing out in real time in Gotham City, and we have that flexibility of a great, big, dense story world where unexpected things can happen. And then this is the chart that explains it all, right there. All right, so what kind of questions do you guys have? Yes.
I have a question. I thank you very much for this beautiful talk, especially the educational insights were very, very helpful. You were speaking about how your experience taught you that long-term ARG experiences don't work because people, get hang up on it and stuff like this. But I'm feeling strongly also with the connection to Halo, what Bungie is doing right now with Destiny, for example. If I'm not mistaken, they're building an MMOG experience with transmedia, game elements, where players can be caught on the phone, etc. And I have also on the web characters and stuff like this that they're maintaining for different platforms for over 10 years.
Right, so I didn't actually say long-term alternate reality game experiences don't work. What I said is repetition. So there's a big difference because some of the most successful alternate reality games are actually multi-year. So that comes back to, again, the way you're designing it, designing for multiple levels of audience, designing it to not always be the exact same thing. And I think that's probably what you're referring to for what you're And there's going to be a lot of experimentation. So, are you guys familiar with the show that came on Sci-Fi? What was the name of it? It started with a D2. Defiance, where they tried to have a TV show and a console game at the same time. And you might say, well, that didn't quite hit it out of the park for me. But again, these are all learning. We should go look at all these things and say, well, what did they learn? What did they do right? What would work every time? What would only work in our particular situation for our story world? But all these things I think are great experiments. But I do think that people who are thinking long-term about franchises, and again, I'm going to differentiate between a transmedia experience, which is a single experience like Year Zero, and a transmedia world like The Dark Knight or like Batman. You know, and people who are thinking about these story worlds are thinking about them working on multiple levels, and even the way you roll it out. You know, how do I build an audience for a franchise where I can get more investment to make the film series because I've already got 2 million people playing my app, you know. So thinking about it that way. Yes.
One of the things that really intrigues me about Year Zero is the fact that it seems like it was much more collaborative with the artist, and that he wove the game into the record and vice versa. And that seems like less so in some of the other projects you've done, especially the mainstream media ones like film projects. But could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's actually not actually true
Okay.
for The Dark Knight, because it was actually, we were actually hired by Chris Nolan. So, and Jonah, who wrote the film, and then Chris takes it over. But yes, the closer you can be to the original storyboard world developers, that's why Infamous is a great example of a co-development project where you're thinking about it and doing it right from the beginning. And I think when the further away you get, which is why some of the marketing transmedia projects, I think, have been further away from actual creative people, I think that you can tell. I think the audience can tell. So we've been fortunate to work with really creative people. That's a good point, though.
Do you have an act structure like television shows? Or do you think of how do you structure the story so that it's coherent while it's still emerging?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. You know, you need to have a structure of really, and you should think of at the center of your act as the audience, and how do you have a successful arc for them, so that if for example, you're doing burst of interactive fiction, whether it's a week, every week, what is it that they accomplish? How do they know that they're at the end? How do they know what to look forward to as the next part of the story? So it's really taking that linear act structure and turning it around into an interactive act structure.
So you're saying it's episodic by week, the way a TV series is episodic by by one episode, but then has a longer story arc. So you're designing it to have a payoff at every week, have an 8-week.
I think it has to be, I'll go back to personal and global. So think about what we loved about X-Files. There's a weekly story, which I'm going to go through, and they're going to get to the end, and they're going to have figured it out and not move their personal relationship forward at all, which is the only reason why I was watching. And then there's the meta story of, are there really aliens? Are we really being abducted? And maybe you get a piece of that, and maybe you wouldn't. So I think in some ways, there has to be this meta theme of what are we all collectively trying to figure out. But then there have to be these encapsulated things, and sometimes they can be very personal. These encapsulated things where you get that aha moment, where you feel like a sense of accomplishment. And you definitely have to have that.
Year Zero wasn't an episodic thing, it was a big story when things happened at different times, right? You're talking.
So it was only episodic in the sense of there were content releases that happened twice a week. But in a sense, we took, up until Year Zero, most of the story roadmaps for ARGs was kind of a braided anthology story that you were trying to figure out. You're following different characters, and you're trying to figure out what's the core story of the world. I Love Beef was like that. It was a radio drama. However, Year Zero was kind of the first time where we said, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to just put out pieces of the world, and people are going to put it together. But it was the mechanism lent itself to that.
It did have a finite end
It,
So
it,
was
it
like
was
a year and
trying
a
to
half,
get you
said?
ultimately to some conclusions about what people were going through. So there was a storyline about someone who was at war and was really kind of struggling with why he was there and what he was doing, writing back to his son who was going through a lot of issues at home. And one of the main ways that we demonstrated their kind of their culture gap is that he was writing letters and his son was drawing comic book pages and sending it to him.
So it would be like a large novel, War and Peace, as opposed to a episodic
Very
series
dense.
of
It's a very
of
dense
Star
story.
Trek or whatever.
Yeah, and people were attracted to different parts of it. Yes.
Archiving and documentation of these games seems to be a common problem. I know that the players will do what they can, but sometimes things just change so quickly that it's difficult to catch everything. And then as an academic, analyzing these games afterwards is hard to do. I was just wondering if you guys ever each had discussed archiving games at all or thought about
And I
it.
do think that you're right to say, like, I'll give you an example of a transmedia project that we brought to Sundance New Frontiers Lab. And if you guys are working on transmedia projects, I would encourage you to submit them to Sundance. New Frontiers has labs where we bring projects and people in and we kind of help them kind of nurture their project and get it out into, and they just opened submissions April 1st. So Sundance New Frontiers. But someone brought a project the first year called 18 Days in Egypt. And it was the fact that, I don't know if you've seen this website, but it was the fact that that whole revolution really happened on social media. And it was really driven by social media. And it kind of overcame a lot of obstacles to kind of get the story out. You get the story in bits and pieces, but the fact is it was coming from a lot of different places and it was being put together. So someone had the idea of let's put that together in a website called 18 Days of Egypt, keep people, inspire people to continue to tell their story. But yet the very name of it, 18 Days in Egypt, dated it. So as cool as it was, and as great an aggregate, a real-time journalistic aggregator that it was, it felt like that already happened. So I think you do have to watch for that, and this sense of, well, that happened, and this group of people were all together, and they experienced that, and I can never go back and experience that again. And a lot of times, like when you're living out, a year and a half between two Batman films, in a sense, that only is going to happen once, and then you've moved on. You're on The Dark Knight Rises. You're like moved on in the fiction. So there's some things that fits for, and then there's other things. Did you guys see the Lizzie Bennet Diaries? Really cool adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, told over social media, two content releases every week for a year. But really, and you guys may not have read Pride and Prejudice, but it's about girls talking about their dating life. Essentially, that really translates to today. And it really worked, right? Because it fit. And you could jump in that at any time because girls are always having trouble with their dating life in Pride and Prejudice and in real life. And so you could just jump in at any moment. And it didn't feel like, oh, I have to go all the way back to the beginning. Or, so I think you have to look at what are the ways that you want to tell your story. There is no footprint for an ARG and what an ARG story is. And so if you are looking at some of the early ones, there were so many mistakes there. You should be looking at what can I learn from that. And one of them is, as an art form, it has to be repeatable, replayable. Yes?
What about player ethics where you don't want to play hoax on your players? What about ethics as maybe by bystanders, so you don't upset bystanders with stuff that goes on in ARGs?
You mean like real people in the real world?
Yeah.
Like upsetting them how? How did you upset someone?
Or just, with like, if they accidentally stumble onto something and they don't understand it, or if something the players is doing is upsetting them. I know that in some of the games that we've designed here, we've had to definitely make sure that we aren't upsetting people or treading on whatever it is that they're doing in their daily lives with our players are doing.
Right. Well, I think if you're going to repurpose something, and obviously, there's a whole cottage industry that's come up by repurposing interactive experiences on places that have a captive audience. So, theme parks, for example, people people are looking at, well, how can I put an interactive experience where people are running around looking at something, the same thing I'm looking at for a whole different reason, they're looking at it for another reason. And I think that what you have to maintain the integrity of both experiences. So you just need to make sure that you're doing it in a way where you can do that.
How much, in terms of designing these projects, how much of the emergence that occurs is planned for? You mentioned that a lot of times you don't know what's going to happen. But I mean, how do you ensure that it sort of stays within the bounds of the story without getting out of control?
Well, that goes back to the spine. And again, being an engineer and an Imagineer, you know things don't work if you don't have the basic mechanics there. So I would, there's been a lot of user-generated content and a lot of people trying to get someone to have agency in creating story and story worlds and virtual worlds and all kinds of things. And the bottom line is that most people are just not that creative. So there's authentic ways that you can do it, or you can give, but in terms of having them make content for you. But I think that for the most part, you have to figure 80% of it out. So like I would say it's the 80-20 rule. You have to know where you're going to get there. The things that I think are cool are is if people do something where they have to work together and do something, they don't do it, but then you know where the story goes when they don't do it. It's not like it's just like, oh, they didn't do it and broke it. But what happened in the world if they didn't save Laura, what happened?
So you put contingencies in the design.
Yeah, you have to know where you're going to get there.
When we did our driving plan art, the players lost.
They did.
Yeah, they just lost. So we were like, what happened? They lost. We won. The bad guys won.
Well, sometimes that's more fun. Yes.
As you were talking about this, I realized that, I knew this already, but I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about it, that there really is a sort of service aspect to this in the same way that Disney treats entertainment as a service. But it's not just you make a thing and you sell it. It's processing happens over time and you have to be responsive to the players. So I was just curious, what aspects did you learn from theme park design that helped you be a better art designer?
Well, I think it's theme park design and also, MMO and console support. So once an MMO goes live, you start CRM, right? So it is really, technical support and customer support are a key part of you feeling like, oh, okay, like I get stuck in the architecture of the world. There's somebody there I got to talk to get out of it. And it's the same for theme parks. Coming from Disney, everything, there's on stage, there's behind stage, there's the guest is always right, the guest is always the most important. It's all about their focus and making sure that their experience is great and never yours. So I think that same amount of support, when you start a transmedia experience, you're essentially starting a live conversation with an audience. It's like if you've been to Sleep No More, or if you've been to, you start something with an eye. It's not like you can just stop halfway through and say, oh, this isn't working out, so you guys have fun, walk through the rest of the building and there's a bar up the top. You can't really do that. You have to, it's like you start stopping the movie halfway through. But I do think you have to contend with things like, whenever you deal with things where people have to, accomplish things or interact with things or work together with things, you start to realize that a lot of the internet is about people complaining. I think that's actually the mission of Twitter. I don't know. It could be written in there. I think it's like, if you have something negative to say it here. But this is kind of one thing that we went through, kind of marrying console game support with, a more organic form of transmedia support, is that people will just say whatever they want to say, and it may or may not be true. And that if you're making an MMO or a console game, because you've been through weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months of testing, you know what a game can do and what it can't do. But when you're doing something that's relying on the audience to kind of feel it, you get a lot of people who they don't want to try, or maybe they did get frustrated, but they're just one out of 2 million people. So do you really chase after that person? There's a lot of balancing that you have to go through. I think what we found early on, and this was with the very first alternate reality game, which was called Beast, is that you can never make enough content and you can never provide enough customer support to the people at the bottom. ever. You know, so you can't chase them. And I think that's what a lot of transmedia people, you know, creators, when they start, they're playing to the bottom of that triangle, and you really can't. You really should be playing to the top of the triangle, and because the bottom people are going to come anyway if they're already kind of invested in the property. And what you really need to make sure is that you get the tone right with them, and that you give them a reason to make this their thing. But then, you know, you let them have a role, but let them be the evangelist. But you have to make the content more accessible for people. And ultimately, if they love Halo and more people are getting into Halo, they're going to be excited about it. If they love Nine Inch Nails and Nine Inch Nails is on the cover of USA Today, they're going to be excited about it. It validates them. You know, I think this is cool, and not everybody does. So it's really about making it broader and more accessible. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about how you develop the core story, like what elements you address, characters, and is there generally a catharsis or conclusion for these?
So sure. So let me think of when to kind of talk through. I can't talk through Infamous because that's still playing out, but so I'll take Tron. So Tron was actually 2.5 years, and the challenge was to take a 28-year-old movie that very few people knew anything about or remembered everything about. On 2 levels, you had a challenge. One was that people may barely remember that Jeff Bridges was in it. I actually saw Tron when I was here at college. So sad. But you know, people may remember Jeff Bridges in it, but they remember Light Cycles and Disc Wars, right? Arcade games. They remember that. So you didn't really have any emotional connection to character. It had been a long time. There wasn't, you know, that movie ended with him getting erased out of the computer. It seemed like it was an encapsulated story. So I think some of the challenges, so I think part of it is when you're looking at a story world, you have to look at the strengths and weaknesses, and like you have to hit some of the weaknesses kind of head on. You know, so for that fiction, for example, one of our main goals was to make an emotional connection to his son. You know, the other goal was to, quite frankly, is connect the world of Tron, which was cool when it came out because it was the first CGI movie. Only cool to us, right? Not cool anymore. In fact, so uncool that Disney didn't even have the disc available for retail during when the new movie was coming out. That's how dated it was, right? So you had to connect it to the people who thought, oh, being rezzed into a computer is the Matrix. You know, so literally we had to come up with ways to make Tron connect to the Matrix generation. So some of it is just like taking those things, and I know I'm not telling you exactly all of the story arcs that kind of played through that, but it was, you know, a son looking for his father's gone, how has he grown up? He's got this tough outer shell, but he's really the softy inside. There's this organization who believes his father's still alive. He's part of them, then he gets discouraged, you know, they don't give up, which is us. We don't give up. We ultimately, you know, communicate into, you know, to send a message to him, thinking that he's trapped somewhere, and that actually causes all the events of Tron to happen. So some of it is like the meta level, being able to sit here and explain to you, like in Infamous, you know, it's a story about 3 conduits who escape from a prison, and it turns out there's a 4th one. And what is she up to? And it plays into this whole feeling in the world of how people feel about conduits. Are they good? Are they bad? It's somewhat similar in the story to X-Men, like, are mutants good or mutants bad? Are conduits good or conduits bad? It's playing into some of those meta themes and giving people a chance to you know, identify some of the themes that are in there. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, no.
Hi, in the overall transmedia space, are you seeing a certain age group or gender that's being more enthusiastic about
That's a
the
good
art form?
question. Well, early on, so there's 10 years of behavioral data, so there's actually a lot known about the transmedia audience. It's just, will anybody tell? But early on, it was early adopters, so I would say, you know, 14 to 29.
Okay.
You know, but like Halo was mostly in that age group. It actually went up to like 39 because you know, Halo was one of the first-person shooters, and so it was really big on the console. So anybody who had a console had access to it, or had kids who had access to it, kind of knew about that world. But what was interesting about the alternate reality game is that it was, whereas Halo was about 80% or 82% male, playing a first-person shooter, the transmedia experience was closer to 55, 65. I mean, 55, 45. And so why did so many women play it? And so we looked at that. We had similar data for The Beast. We were looking at it and said it has to be the kind of procedural drama, crime drama, piece together the evidence, figure out what the characters' motivations are, kind of looking beyond the surface that really attracted the female players. And ever since then, we've had more of a 50-50 split. So even when we were working on Why So Serious for The Dark Knight, one of the main challenges from the studio was we want women who have never read a comic book or would never go see a comic book movie to come to this one. It was like really laying down the gauntlet.
Yeah.
And it just so happened that it was during the primaries and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were in a Democratic kind of contest that was playing out. And we said, well, every Bat, fan knows who Harvey Dent is and knows that ultimately he's going to be district attorney of Gotham City, but why don't we hold an election for him? But even before that, going back to the message at the time is why don't we have citizens of Gotham City really convince Harvey Dent to run? Because he's reluctant, because he doesn't know that they really want change. So it kind of played into contemporary messages, again, like Year Zero, where you're just like one step away from what's really happening, and you're giving people a way to get into it. So I think making it accessible, there's like, you could just have like a whole book about that. Like, how do you make it accessible? Part of it is making it accessible to people who have diverse interests. So it could be that my way into the story is not your way into the story. It could be that you are all about Batman and you don't believe that he's a vigilante, you believe he's 100% right, and that he's much better than Superman because he chose to be a hero, and all that kind of stuff, whereas I'm just kind of like, Harvey Dent's cute. Do you know what I'm saying? I
Yeah,
mean, like,
exactly.
literally, like,
But we both have
he's
a
played by
path,
Aaron
so-
Eckhart, and he's adorable, and, something like that, and the Joker is just this weird, odd character.
Thanks.
All right, I think that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Right.